black with the heat. The natives of the country are black. He didn't say dark-skinned, he didn't say dark complexion, he said black, even if dark complexion means black. And this is not the only translation that uses black in this passage. Several translations use the term black because the ancient Greek term used in this passage was a strong term to denote black. We know that many ancient Greek scholars have been to ancient Egypt and left written records about their travels in the great ancient civilization. But what most people don't know is what the ancient scholars actually said about the ancient population of Egypt. In fact, many ignore that several prominent and reliable ancient Greek and Roman scholars have left in their accounts physical descriptions of the ancient Egyptians. Your lack of awareness of these accounts is only normal, since they are simply not discussed by modern mainstream Egyptologists and documentaries on ancient Egyptian history. They are actually completely ignored. Another reason is the fact that these accounts are not easily found, and if one has heard them mentioned at all, one has to go through hours of research and reading of those old books in order to find them, which is, in all honesty, not everyone's cup of tea. Well, fear not, my friend, I got you. After countless hours of researching the books and reading through them, I have managed to find the passages where the ancient Greek scholars such as Herodotus and Aristotle, as well as Roman scholars such as Lucian of Samosata and Ammianus Marcellinus, actually give us a physical description of the ancient Egyptians. What they say is quite edifying. Stick around if you want to see them. All the materials that will be used in this video are linked in the description below. I urge you to please go look them up and read them for yourself. Right, let's stop wasting more time and jump into this video. Well, what do the Egyptologists say about these accounts? Well, not much actually. I mean, I read through a whole report of a symposium discussing the race of the ancient Egyptians, and when these accounts were brought up, the modern scholars simply ignored them. Really, I'm not kidding, they ignored them. Something this relevant was ignored. That's just funny. Right, aside from the symposium, most modern scholars only discuss what Herodotus said about the Colchians, as if that was the only passage in his book where he mentioned the race of the ancient Egyptians. We shall see very soon that that was not the case. Another common practice of the modern mainstream Egyptologists is simply to discredit the very same great philosophers and scholars that the Hellenists and European historians revere so much. It's a shame, really. It's a shame that these people would be out here trying to make people believe that the ancient scholars didn't have a good sense of observation, or that all of them had some vision problem or something. Come on. Get serious. These are the same guys that are hailed as father of this and that field, and yet one would doubt their ability to give a simple, accurate physical description of something they saw. Or is it just an attempt of modern Egyptologists to steer away from the fact that the ancient Egyptians were black Africans by inventing new definitions or reinterpreting simple words and making the authors say what they did not say? You will be the judge of that after you've read all the passages that will be presented here. One thing you must know though is that the view of European scholars has not always been this way. Before the 19th century, it was widely accepted and known that the ancient Egyptians were black Africans related to their brothers further south. To illustrate this, here are a few quotes from three authorities on the subject. One is the founding father of Egyptology himself, also known as Jean-François Champollion or Champollion the Young, who said in a letter sent to his brother when traveling in Egypt in the 19th century, "The first tribes that inhabited Egypt, that is, the Nile Valley between the Seine, Cataract and the sea, came from Abyssinia to Sennaar. The ancient Egyptians belonged to a race quite similar to the Quinas or Barabras, present inhabitants of Nubia. In the Copts of Egypt, we do not find any of the characteristic features of the ancient Egyptian population. The Copts are the result of crossbreeding with all the nations that have successively dominated Egypt. It is wrong to seek in them the principal features of the old race. He goes on to say, this manner of viewing the tableau is all the more accurate because on the other tombs the same generic names reappear, always in the same order. We find there Egyptians and Africans represented in the same way, which could not be otherwise but the Nama or the Asians and the Tamu or the Europeans present significant and curious variants. End of quote. So we can see here that the father of Egyptology himself could not come to another conclusion but to admit that the ancient Egyptians were black Africans. They belonged to the race of the Barbaras and the Canoes, which are Nubians, and Nubians are black. The darkest people on the planet, remember? Yes, Nubians. And again, he talks about the Copts being a mix of the ancient Egyptians, black ancient Egyptians, and the various populations that invaded them. Those are the Hyksos, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, so many invaded Egypt. The last one being the Arabs. So many invasions, so much crossbreeding and all that. Again, not me who is saying it. Here is Jean-François Champollion, father of Egyptology, the first man to have deciphered the hieroglyphics. He came to the same conclusion that anyone would come up with when looking at the various ancient Egyptian paintings and statues representing typical African features. I'm not the only one who has said that. Many European scholars prior to the 19th century said the same thing. The other scholar is Constantin François, Comte de Volney, a French philosopher and savant, specialist of the Orient, born in 1757, who wrote in his book about the travels in Egypt and Syria. All have a bloated face, puffed up eyes, flat nose, thick lips. In a word, the true face of the mulatto. I was tempted to attribute it to the climate, but when I visited the Sphinx, its appearance gave me the key to the riddle. On seeing that head, typically Negro in all its features, I remembered the remarkable passage where Herodotus says, "As for me, I judge the Colchians to be a colony of the Egyptians because, like them, they are black with woolly hair." In other words, the ancient Egyptians were true Negroes of the same type as all native-born Africans. That being so, we can see how their blood, mixed for several centuries with that of the Romans and Greeks, must have lost the intensity of its original color, while retaining nonetheless the imprints of its original mold. We can even state as a general principle that the face is a kind of monument able, in many cases, to attest or shed light on historical evidence on the origin of peoples. End of quote. Volney was a well-respected authority on the Orient and was once the head of the French Academy, a very important organization for scholars in France. Again, another scholar prior to the 19th century saying that the Egyptians were black because he could not conclude otherwise when you look at the Sphinx. The Sphinx has a very strong prognatism. The nose is gone, but you can tell that was an African nose. Another scholar is the brother of Jean-François Champollion, father of Egyptology, Champollion Figeac, who was a proponent of a white Egypt, said in his memoir, "The opinion that the ancient Egyptian population of Egypt belonged to the Negro African race is an error long accepted as truth. Since the Renaissance, travelers in the East, barely capable of fully appreciating the ideas provided by Egyptian monuments on this important question, have helped to spread that false notion, and geographers have not failed to reproduce it, even in our day." So here you can see that he said long accepted as truth. This demonstrates that the general opinion of most Renaissance scholars on this subject was that the Egyptians were black Africans. We can clearly see that given the evidence at hand, the only conclusion reasonable to Renaissance scholars was that ancient Egypt was a black civilization. Now let's take a look at what the ancient scholars said about this same topic. The first scholar we're going to look at is Herodotus, known as the father of history. Herodotus was a Greek historian of the 5th century BCE who left us a collection of books called the Histories, where he recounts, reports, and tries to explain events that he witnessed or that were told to him by the people he encountered during his travels. Herodotus traveled to ancient Libya, Egypt, Ethiopia, the Middle East, and so on. And guys, this is important to mention. When giving an account of something, Herodotus was always careful to let us know whether it was something he observed or heard himself or something that was told to him. And when giving an explanation of some phenomenon, Herodotus always made sure to let the reader know whether it was his opinion, a fact, or something he was told. Hence, not someone who just reported funny stories without critically thinking about them. That's why he was called the father of history. So what did Herodotus actually say about the ancient Egyptians? Well, in the histories, we have 3 passages where Herodotus mentions that the ancient Egyptians have black skin. All are found in Book 2 in various sections. The first passage is in section 22, where he discusses the reason for the flooding of the Nile. Herodotus gives 3 reasons for this phenomenon, of which the third reason states, "Thirdly, it is certain that the natives of the country are black with the heat." Black with the heat. The natives of the country are black. He didn't say dark-skinned. He didn't say dark-complexioned. He said black, even if dark-complexion means black. And this is not the only translation that uses black in this passage. Several translations use the term black because the ancient Greek term used in this passage was a strong term to denote black. The term was melinus, which means very black, very dark, very swarthy. So you have it there, black with the heat. They were black. The natives of Egypt were black with heat. That's why the Nile floods, according to Herodotus. The second passage is in section 57, where he discusses the origin of the oracle of Zeus at Dona. Here Herodotus gives us an explanation for why the dove was called black, which states, "Lastly, by calling the dove black, the Dodonians indicated that the woman was an Egyptian." Again, to talk about the Egyptian, Herodotus uses the term black. And this is not the only translation of these texts that use the term black instead of any other term to denote darkness, right? He uses the term black. So in this part, for those who don't understand what is going on here, for those who might not have the time to read this, so Herodotus is giving an explanation to a sort of myth that was given to him by the priest at Dodona about how they ended up worshipping this oracle, right? How they were introduced to the worship of the god Zeus. Then they started telling him that there was a dove that came and then she was on a tree, she started speaking, whatever, right? The dove was black. So Herodotus thinks to himself, there is no way a dove started talking. That is bollocks. So he gives us his own interpretation of the story. He tries to explain in a rational way what those terms might mean, such as okay, the fact that they say the dove started speaking with a human voice. To Herodotus, that's because the woman was speaking a foreign language that the locals interpreted as just bird noises. And eventually she learned the local language. That's when they say she started speaking with a human voice. And he also asked himself, why did they call the dove black? Then he comes with this last reason. The dove was called black because the woman was from Egypt, which gives us really strong evidence on the race of the ancient Egyptians. Herodotus links black to the ancient Egyptians, not the Libyans, not the Middle Eastern peoples. He'd been to the Middle East, and he still does not link black to the Middle East. He links black with Egypt and the Ethiopians. So he says she was black because she was from Egypt. The third passage is in section 104, where he discusses the origin of the Colchians, in which he says, "There can be no doubt that the Colchians are an Egyptian race. Before I heard any mention of the fact from others, I had remarked it myself. My own conjectures were founded, first on the fact that they are black-skinned and have woolly hair, which certainly accounts to but little since several other nations are so too, but further and more especially on the circumstances that the Colchians, the Egyptians, and the Ethiopians are the only nations who have practiced circumcision from the earliest times. There you have it. This is the passage that is always brought up when discussing the testimonies by ancient scholars. It is a less strong passage than the two we've previously seen. Nonetheless, it is still extra evidence. This time we have the hair texture that was given. It's woolly hair. I've heard a scholar say the term woolly is kind of ambiguous. It's crinkly hair. The texture that you find in Africa, like East Africa and Southern Africa, that texture is what is described in this passage. Notice that this translation says black-skinned, but many scholars said it's not black-skinned, it's dark-skinned. But a lot of scholars do disagree, and vehemently, because the term used is melanchroes. Melanchroes is again a strong term to denote a dark hue, because the term meline is in there. That's why the Greek scholars say that it must be black, not dark-skinned. I have two translations that refer to this as black-skinned, not dark-skinned, but a lot of other translations use dark-skinned. But Africans are dark-skinned too. So whatever, they just want an ambiguity there, saying that no, it could have been anybody. This is like, nah, he was talking about the black skin of the Africans, the dark skin of the Africans, since in two previous passages he referred to the ancient Egyptians as blacks. And notice that he says here that other nations are so too, but the reason why he thinks the Colchians are descendants of the Egyptians is because them, the Ethiopians and the Egyptians, are the only people to practice circumcision in the whole world from the earliest time. So again, another link, another strong link. So after these three passages, we can already conclude that the ancient Egyptians had black skin and crinkly or woolly hair. We could even stop here, but no, we gotta continue. There is more. The second scholar is Aristotle, a Greek philosopher of the 4th century BCE, who in the Physiognomics writes, "Those who are excessively black are cowardly." This applies to the Egyptians and the Ethiopians. Quick note, scholars are not actually sure that Aristotle wrote these books. They just attributed it to him since he was a great scholar. Well, again, another philosopher or scholar who links excessive darkness with Egypt and Ethiopia. He could have said Libya, he could have said Syria, he could have said any other country where the so-called dark-skinned people live, but he did not, because they're not dark-skinned, they're not excessively black, they're not excessively dark. Another translation of this shies away from the term black, of which a lot of scholars do not agree with, because the term used in ancient Greek was agan melaines, which means excessively black, very, very black. When modern scholars come and say that the North Africans are seen as excessively dark or dark-complexioned by the Europeans, I just find it strange, because the term used to denote North Africa is white Africa, and the term used to denote Southern Africa is black Africa. So how do you call them white and then you say no, they're actually dark to us? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't. They're just shying away from these facts. These simple facts is that their ancestors said that the ancient Egyptians were black people. They called them that in so many of their books, called them black people, dark-skinned people, dark complexion. We could stop here, but I got more. The third ancient scholar we have is Aeschylus, a Greek poet of the 6th century BCE, who in his play, The Suppliant Maidens, refers to ancient Egyptians as black not once, but twice. Here is the first quote describing the men of the Egyptian fleet. "The men on board are plainly seen, their black limbs showing from their white attire. The rest of the ships and all the assisting fleet stand clear in view." So you can see here, the term black was used to describe the limbs of the ancient Egyptian fleet. This is a poet referring to the Egyptians as black because they were black. You can say it's a fictional story, there's no reality to it, but when referring to the Ethiopians in their stories, they always use black skin as well, and dark skin, dark complexion. We have evidence for this further in this video, so stick around. I mean, you can put reality into fiction, like some real elements, such as looks of people around. And here's the second quote. In ships, stout-timbered and dark-prowed, they have sailed here, attended by a mighty black host, and in their wrath overtaken us. So again, the term black was used to describe the host of ancient Egypt that is about to overtake Greece. They were black, all of them. And there's more. The fourth scholar is Achilles Tatius, a Roman-era Greek writer of the 2nd century AD, who writes in his The Loves of Clitopho and Leucippe, Book 3. Having fortunately some money left, we engaged an Egyptian vessel and proceeded by way of the Nile to Alexandria, when in a moment the bark was thronged with men of formidable and savage mien. They were all tall and stout. Their complexion was black, not the jet black of the Indians, but that of a mongrel Ethiopian. Again, these are Egyptian men who jumped on the bark and thronged it and shaked it a little bit. And they are again referred to as black, but not the jet black of the Indians, but the jet black of the mongrel Ethiopians. So again, comparing the ancient Egyptians to the Ethiopians, very similar people, very same in features and complexion. The fifth scholar is called Heliodorus, a Greek writer of the 3rd century AD, who in his Ethiopics refers to the ancient Egyptians and the Ethiopians/Nubians as dark-complexioned. Here is the quote about the Egyptians. The Egyptians, observing this, began to change their opinion, but she, startled at the noise they made and the shadow they cast, raised herself up, and just looking at them, again bent down, not in the least terrified at their unusual complexion and piratical appearance. But when the pirates, advancing, stood in front and seemed preparing to seize her, she raised herself again, and seeing their dark complexion and rugged looks. So here again, the author is describing the Egyptians as dark-complexioned. Here is the quote about the Ethiopians/Nubians. Merobbus was a handsome youth. The Ethiopian guards opened on either side to let him pass. The youth, at the mention of a wife, was seen to blush through his dark complexion from mingled pleasure and modesty, the red rushing, as it were, to the surface of the black. So here again, we have an author describing a black person with dark complexion. So that was used again to describe the Egyptians that were on the boat. And here is the 1717 translation of the same passage. Merobbus, young and bashful and wonderfully tickled at the thoughts of a bride, blushed through his black skin, his face looking like a bowl of soot that had taken fire. Again, black. So this is evidence to show you that when they use dark complexion as the translation of what the ancient Greeks said, they mean black. The translation should be black, but they use dark complexion to steer away from referring to the Egyptians and Ethiopians as black. That is, the ancient Nubians or Cushites. And there is more, people, there is more. Stick around. The sixth scholar is Ammianus Marcellinus, a Roman historian of the 4th century AD, who in his Book of History of Rome, Book 22, Chapter 16, Section 23, says about the inhabitants of Egypt. The inhabitants of Egypt are generally swarthy and dark-complexioned. Again, generally swarthy and dark-complexioned. This proves my conclusion in the previous videos that the majority population of Egypt was black African. This quote here from an ancient historian proves it. The inhabitants of Egypt are generally swarthy and dark-complexioned. This translation again shies away from saying black. Swarthy basically means black. Dark-complexioned means black. The seventh scholar is Lucian of Samosata, a Roman Syrian satirist of the 2nd century AD, who wrote in his The Shape or the Wishes. As for this fella, to say nothing of his dark skin and protruding lips and spindle shanks, his words came tumbling out in a heap, one on the top of another. It was Greek, of course, but the voice, the accent were Egyptian born. And then his hair. No freeman ever had his hair tied up in a knot behind like that. So again, dark-skinned being used to describe an Egyptian man. Here, not only dark-skinned was used, but another feature, did you notice it? The protruding lips, a very typical African feature, as well as spindle shanks. Spindle shanks are very common in Africa, especially in the east of Africa, such as the Maasai people. And spindle shanks are very common in East Africa among the Nilotic peoples. These are again very dark-skinned people in Africa. So dark-skinned, protruding lips, and spindle shanks. So guys, there you have it. Multiple accounts referring to the ancient Egyptians as black or dark-complexioned with woolly hair and sometimes even protruding lips. Most of these are direct accounts, by the way, yet they're always overlooked when discussing the race of the ancient Egyptians. Why? Well, that's a topic for another video. So, with this additional evidence, the only thing to conclude at this point is that the ancient Egyptians were a black African race. I mean, ancient authors go to Africa, find people there and call them black or dark in complexion with woolly hair, and somehow we are still debating on whether they are black. Come on, make it make sense. Imagine if this was an ancient population described as pale complexioned in Europe. There would be no debate whatsoever on whether they were white. A little intellectual honesty, fellas. We already saw in our previous videos where we took a closer look at wall paintings and statues and found that many ancient Egyptians represented there had dark brown skin with typical African facial features and hair texture, not to mention the numerous similarities with their black Nubian neighbors to the south in representation as well as culture and language. These similarities were not only noticed by me, but by renowned authorities such as the father of Egyptology himself and the Comte de Volney. So these additional testimonies by the ancient scholars who actually saw the ancient Egyptians only further prove that the ancient Egyptians were a black race from Africa. Some might say this evidence is irrelevant since there are DNA studies out there proving that the ancient Egyptians were from the Middle East. What do you say to that? Huh? Well, don't worry. I am aware of those genetic studies and I find that there are several issues with them. In the next video, we shall discuss the genetic studies done on ancient mummies and the various problems that are found in those studies. Be patient. So that is my opinion now, given the undeniable evidence at hand. However, this is an open discussion, so feel free to agree or disagree in the comment section. And please bring some worthwhile counter-arguments backed with evidence. I'd really appreciate that. Peace.